She was still breathing, lying alone on the icy slopes of Mount Everest. Barely conscious, barely alive, Frances Arsentive waited for help that would never come. More than a dozen climbers passed her that day. Some stopped, some cried, but none saved her. Why would anyone leave a living person to die? In 1998, Frances Arsentive became the first American woman to summit Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen. It should have been a triumph. Instead, it became one of the mountain's most haunting tragedies. Her final hours were witnessed by others. She was alive. She spoke, she pleaded, and still, she was left behind. This is not just a story about the dangers of Everest. It's about ethics, about decisions made at the edge of death, about the brutal calculations climbers face at 8,500 meters, where oxygen runs out and every step could be your last. Was Frances abandoned? Was she beyond saving? Or was there simply nothing more anyone could do? She's remembered today as the Sleeping Beauty of Everest, a tragic symbol, a haunting presence, a silent question still echoing on the world's highest peak. And today, we are telling her story, completely, honestly. Finally, before she became a symbol of Everest tragedy, Frances Arsentive was a woman with dreams, real, human dreams. She was born in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1958 and grew up between places like Colorado and Utah. From a young age, she was drawn to the outdoors. Mountains weren't just scenery, they were possibility, freedom, silence, power. She studied at the University of Louisville and later earned a master's degree in business from Columbia. Educated, articulate, independent. She had a sharp mind and a quiet resilience. She wasn't loud or reckless. She was thoughtful, disciplined, and deeply motivated. But it wasn't until she met Sergei Arsentive, a Russian mountaineer, that climbing evolved from a hobby to a life pursuit. They married in 1992, and their bond extended far beyond romance. It was a shared love of exploration. They traveled, climbed, planned, their ultimate goal: to summit the 7 summits, the highest peaks on each continent together. Frances wasn't a professional climber. She didn't have a documentary crew or major brand sponsorship. What she had was grit, and Everest was her greatest goal. But not just Everest. Everest without bottled oxygen. It had never been done by an American woman, and that, to her, mattered. In 1998, they returned to Nepal to make their second attempt. They were older, wiser, and better prepared, but they also knew the risks. Frances was not chasing fame. She wasn't trying to prove anything to the world. She wanted to finish something. She and Sergei started to do something few dared attempt, to show that it could be done. But as they began their final ascent, neither of them knew that what lay ahead would change everything. In May of 1998, Frances and Sergei Arsentive stood at the foot of the world's tallest mountain, Mount Everest, 29,032 feet of ice, wind, and uncertainty. They had chosen the north side dash. Tibet, it's colder, windier, and far less traveled than the commercial south route. But for them, it was the path of purity. No guides, no sherpas, no supplemental oxygen. Just the two of them manned the mountain. Their plan was ambitious: climb high, descend, rest, and repeat. This acclimatization rotation would help prepare their bodies to handle the thin air above 8,000 meters. But Everest doesn't care about plans. Weather delays slowed them down. One night, their headlamps failed, forcing an unexpected bivouac in sub-zero temperatures. Another night, they misjudged their water supply. Still, they kept going. They established high camps. They communicated by radio, and by May 22nd, they reached Camp 6, just below the infamous death zone. Frances was showing signs of fatigue. Her speech slowed. Her steps faltered, but she kept pushing. On May 23rd, they launched their summit bid. There were no other climbers around them, just the two. In silence, beneath a limitless sky. It was slow. Too slow by the time they reached the summit was dangerously late. No supplemental oxygen meant their bodies were breaking down even faster. They were severely hypoxic, vision blurred, muscles weak. They didn't stay long. Just a few photos, a moment together, and then the descent. But Everest was unraveling them. Frances began to deteriorate rapidly. She was disoriented, struggling to move. Her words slurred. She fell more than so. Once Sergei helped her down inch by inch. He urged her to keep going, but they were losing time. Nightfall was coming. Temperatures were plummeting, and she couldn't walk. By the time they reached Camp 6 again, she collapsed, barely responsive. They had made the summit, but Everest wasn't done with them yet, and the real nightmare was just beginning. Frances and Sergei had summited, but getting to the top is only half the climb. As they descended, the air grew thinner, and Frances grew weaker. She could barely stand. Her vision was fading, and worst of all, she couldn't speak. Clearly, the symptoms were unmistakable. Severe hypoxia, without oxygen. Her brain and muscles were shutting down. She fell repeatedly, slid on patches of ice at one point. She dropped her pack and oxygen canister. Though empty, it was there only. Backup Sergei was exhausted too, but he refused to leave her. At Camp 6, they spent the night exposed. No tent, no sleeping bags, just their gear, huddled against the cold. In the open air of the death zone. By morning, Frances was barely responsive. Sergei made a desperate decision. He left her behind temporarily to descend and bring help. He believed she'd survive just a little longer. She had to, while Sergei descended the mountain. A group of Uzbek climbers were making their way up, and then they found her. Francis, still breathing, still conscious. She was sitting upright, leaning against a rock. Her face was swollen, her lips cracked. She could barely whisper, but she was alive. They tried to help. They gave her oxygen. They tried to carry her down, but the terrain was steep, and they were exhausted. Eventually, after hours of struggle, they left her, convinced she was unsavable. When Sergei returned to Camp 6, Frances was gone, confused, panicked, and still without oxygen. He searched. He was last seen climbing upward. Again, likely retracing steps. Some believe he thought she'd crawled higher, or that he was delirious from hypoxia himself. Days later, Sergei's body was found. He had fallen, likely while trying to reach his wife. 2 lives were lost. They had reached the summit, but the descent, the part no one trains for, had taken them both. And the cruelest detail: Frances was still alive when people left. She had survived the climb, but no one could save her from the descent. The next morning, May 24th, more climbers began pushing toward the summit. Among them were Ian Woodall and Cathy O'Dowd, of a South African team, making their own attempt as they climbed through the death zone. They saw something strange ahead. A person, sitting upright, barely moving. It was Frances, still breathing, still alive. Her face was pale, lips blue. Frostbite had claimed her hands and cheeks. Her oxygen mask hung loosely from her face. Her suit was unzipped. She was exposed to the elements, likely for more than 24 hours. Her eyes were open but glassy, like she was fading in and out of consciousness. They rushed to her, wrapped her in clothing, gave her oxygen, tried to keep her awake. They spoke gently, held her hand, told her to hang on, but the truth hit them fast. She couldn't walk. She couldn't respond. She was too far gone. There was no way to carry her down the steep, icy slopes with the thin team they had. No stretchers, no support crew, just sheer cliffs. blowing snow, and exhaustion. They had their own summit to reach, but even if they'd turned back, they couldn't have carried her alone. They tried everything. They stayed for over an hour, but her condition only worsened. She was slipping away. Kathy O'Dowd described the moment years later. It was the hardest decision of my life. I still live with it. They left Frances sitting upright, leaning against a rock wall. The cold would soon take her. Her final hours were slow and witnessed. She wasn't just left behind. She was seen, held, spoken to, comforted in the most impossible of conditions, and then abandoned again. It's a scene that haunts climbers and audiences alike. Could more have been done? Was there another choice? Or were the climbers simply surviving themselves? One thing is clear. Frances Arsentive didn't die alone, but she did die unanswered. What happened to Frances? Arsentive wasn't a secret. It was witnessed by multiple teams. On the mountain that day, word spread quickly through the camps. Some heard it on radio. Others saw her with their own eyes, sitting there, eyes open, still breathing. The Uzbek team that had encountered her first tried to help. They offered oxygen. They tried to drag her lower, but with no Sherpa support, no pulk sled, and no real rescue tools. They were powerless. They struggled for hours, and then they left her. Then came the South African Team Woodall, and, single quotes. They stayed the longest. They were honest about their failure to save her. Their account brought international attention to what happened, but it also opened a storm of ethical debate. Is it right to climb past someone who's dying? Is survival a justification for abandonment? Some climbers defended their actions. At that altitude, even helping someone for too long can mean death for both. It's not selfishness, it's survival, but others weren't convinced. Was Frances truly beyond help? Or was she a victim of summit fever, the obsession with reaching the top no matter what? And what about Sergei? He died trying to save her. He gave up his summit, his safety, his life. That decision made him a hero to some. To others, it raised even more questions. What if he had stayed with her? What if they had turned back earlier? It's easy to judge from sea level, but at 8,500 meters, judgment fades and instinct takes over. What happened to Frances Arsentive left a scar not just on the mountain, but on the conscience of every climber who passed her by. Some remember her as Sleeping Beauty. Others just remember her eyes. The death of Frances Arsentive and her husband, Sergei, sent shockwaves through the mountaineering world for days. No one on Everest could stop talking about it, not just because it was tragic. Climbers die on Everest almost every year, but because she was alive, seen, heard, left behind. The South African team's public testimony drew intense media attention. Articles, interviews, documentaries. Frances' name became inseparable from one burning question: could she have been saved? Climbers began to reflect on what they would have done. Would they risk their own lives? Would they carry a dying person down if it meant missing the summit? Ethicists, journalists, and survivors debated it for years. And then came the nickname, the Sleeping Beauty of Everest. A name that stripped her of identity, turning her into a symbol, beautiful, frozen, helpless. But Frances was so much more. She was a mother, a wife, an adventurer who dared greatly. Someone who wasn't chasing fame, only personal triumph, and she died doing what she loved. That, some say, is a kind of honor. But her story didn't end in 1998 to 8 years later. In 2007, Ian Woodall, one of the climbers who'd found her return to Everest. He found her body still sitting upright on the mountainside. She had become a landmark passed by others for years. With great care, Woodall and his small team performed a brief ceremony and moved her remains off the trail. They wrapped her in a sleeping, bagged up, read messages from her family, and finally gave her peace. They called it the Tao of Everest. It was closure, at least, the kind Everest allows. But her death changed things. More climbers began questioning. Commercial expeditions: should people without alpine experience be allowed to climb Everest? Should there be rules for rescue preparation, limits to permits, accountability for guides, and more personally? What would you do if you saw someone alive and dying on Everest? The mountain doesn't offer easy answers, but it asks hard questions. Francie's Arsentive's story became a mirror, reflecting our choices, our humanity, and the high cost of reaching the top. Everest is more than a mountain. It's a myth, a magnet, a mirror. For some, it represents the ultimate adventure. For others, the ultimate risk. But for Francie's Arsentive, it was something more personal. It was a dream shared with the man she loved, a challenge she was willing to face with everything she had. She wasn't trying to break records. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing a promise. To herself and to Sergei. And she did reach the summit. She did what no American woman had ever done without supplemental oxygen. But it came at the highest possible cost. Her story is not about failure. It's about the price of pursuit, about what happens when the human spirit meets human limits, when ambition and altitude collide. We like to believe we'd do the right thing in a crisis, that we'd never leave someone behind, that we'd risk everything for another life. But at 8,600 meters, where oxygen is scarce, decisions become blurred. Survival becomes primal. Francie's Arsentive was left behind, but she was also remembered, honored, and finally laid to rest with dignity. Thanks to the compassion of those who returned for her, her story changed. Everest, it made climbers look twice at their choices. It made the world ask difficult questions about courage, compassion, and consequence. Because Everest doesn't just test your strength, it tests your soul. And in the end, Francie showed us something real. That even in a place so cold, so ruthless, human stories still matter. So if this story moved you, share it. Let her name be remembered. Let her legacy challenge the next climber. And let her life remind us all that even in death, dignity matters. If you want more stories that climb deeper than the surface, subscribe, like, and stay with us. There's more to uncover.